Tucked into the hollows of eastern Tennessee, in a county called Hancock, there are families whose faces have puzzled their neighbors for 200 years. Olive skin, dark hair, eyes that are sometimes startlingly light. For generations, people called them Portuguese, called them Turks, called them the lost descendants of a vanished colony on the coast of North Carolina. They were called many things, but rarely were they simply believed. These are the Melungeons, and the question that has followed them since the early 1800s is not just where they came from, but why their ancestry looked so different from everyone else around them. Most of Appalachia traces back to a fairly narrow band of European origins, mostly the British Isles, with little variation from valley to valley. The Melungeons do not fit that pattern. Their genome carries threads from across the Atlantic and beyond it, woven together in colonial Virginia long before anyone wrote their story down. To understand why they look different on a genetic level, you have to go back to a time when American law had no category for people like them at all. A category they never fit, and a silence that would last for centuries. The story of the Melungeons begins not in the mountains, but in the lowlands, in the tidewater counties of colonial Virginia and across the border into the Carolinas. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, there were already families living there whose ancestry did not fit cleanly into the categories colonial law was built around. Not white, not enslaved, not clearly anything the system had a name for. Officially, many were classified as free people of color, a label that sounds neutral but carried enormous weight. It placed them in a strange middle space, technically free, but stripped of the rights that came with whiteness. Virginia's laws tightened steadily through the 18th century. Free people of color could be denied the right to vote. They could be barred from owning land outright in certain areas, or have that ownership challenged in court. Their children could be denied access to schools. Testimony from a person of color often carried less weight, or none at all, in a dispute with a white neighbor. For families who looked different, who carried features that marked them as outsiders, even among other free people of color, these restrictions were not abstract. They shaped where you could live, what you could own, whether your children had a future where you were. By the early 1700s, this created a quiet but serious calculation. Stay in the established communities of Virginia and the Carolinas, where land was already claimed and racial scrutiny was intensifying, or move toward the edges of the colonial map, where enforcement was thinner and land was unclaimed. For many of these families, the mountains were not a romantic frontier. They were the only direction left open. The Appalachian interior, still largely beyond the reach of colonial courts and tax rolls, offered something the lowlands no longer could: distance. Distance from neighbors who asked too many questions, distance from officials who could revoke a deed, distance from a legal system that had already decided what kind of people they were before they ever opened their mouths to offer so much as a single word. So they moved. Families who had been living on the margins of Virginia and the Carolinas pushed westward, following the same routes that carried other settlers into Tennessee, Kentucky, and the western reaches of Virginia. But where most pioneers were chasing open land and easy opportunity, these families were chasing something more basic: the chance to simply be left alone. One destination stands out above the rest. Hancock County, Tennessee, tucked into the northeastern corner of the state along the Clinch River, became a center of gravity for these families. Their descendants still live there today, in the same hollows their ancestors settled 2 centuries ago. The mountains gave them what the lowlands never could: steep ridges, narrow valleys, and forests that made travel slow and difficult, also made enforcement slow and difficult. A tax collector or a sheriff who might show up regularly in a tidewater county had very little reason to climb 3 ridgelines to reach an isolated farmstead. But sanctuary came at a cost. The terrain that protected these families from outside scrutiny was the same terrain that limited what they could grow, how easily they could trade, and how connected they were to the wider world. Fertile bottomland was scarce. Roads were poor or non-existent. A trip to a county seat could mean a full day's travel each way. For people who had already chosen isolation as a form of protection, this geography reinforced the choice it had made possible. Over generations, That isolation did something else, something less practical and more profound. It turned a scattered group of families into something closer to a community, with its own internal logic, its own shared experiences, and eventually its own identity in the eyes of outsiders. Neighbors in nearby valleys knew these families were different, even if they could not always say how or why. They lived among them, traded with them, sometimes intermarried with them, but always with an awareness of separateness. That awareness, repeated across generations, hardened into something durable. An identity shaped as much by where they ended up as by any single bloodline. Cut off in the mountains, the Melungeons did what isolated communities have always done. They told stories about where they came from, and those stories did real work. The most persistent one held that their ancestors were Portuguese or Spanish sailors, shipwrecked off the Atlantic coast, who made their way inland and intermarried with Native American populations they encountered along the way. Another version reached further back, tying their origins to the lost colony of Roanoke, the English settlers who vanished from North Carolina in the late 1500s, and to Cherokee communities some believed had absorbed them. These were not idle campfire tales. In a society obsessed with racial classification, a story that began with European sailors and ended with intermarriage to Native Americans carried weight. It offered an origin that was foreign and exotic, but European at its root, an identity that came with more protections than the alternatives. Families told these stories to their children, and their children told them to outsiders, partly out of belief and partly as armor. The earliest written traces of the Melungeons as a distinct group appear in the early 1800s. One of the more striking comes from 1813 in church records from southwestern Virginia, where a woman was condemned for sheltering people identified as Melungeons, treated as something close to a moral failing by association. By the 1840s, they had become a fixture of regional speculation, written about as a strange and separate people whose darker complexions invited theories ranging from African ancestry to descent from Ottoman Turks abandoned by Spanish expeditions. None of these outside theories were kind. They were attempts by neighbors to slot an unfamiliar group into a familiar framework, one that justified suspicion or distance. The Melungeons' own stories, by contrast, were attempts to do the opposite, to claim a place inside the framework rather than outside it. Both sets of stories, the ones told about them and the ones they told about themselves, would eventually run into the same wall. None of them could be tested until DNA gave the truth a voice it never had before. Stories about shipwrecked sailors and lost colonies were one layer of defense. Another layer was more direct, simply becoming someone else, at least on paper. Passing, blending into white society by minimizing or denying any non-European heritage, was one of the most effective survival strategies available to Melungeon families. And two specific labels became central to how that worked. The first was Black Dutch. On the surface, it sounds almost like a joke, an odd pairing of words with no clear meaning. In practice, it functioned as a euphemism, a way of explaining a darker complexion or unusual features without ever invoking the racial categories that carried legal consequences. If a family was Black Dutch, the implication went, they were simply a darker branch of German or Dutch ancestry, nothing more. The second label, Black Irish, worked the same way, offering a story rooted in European regions known for darker hair and eyes, one that could absorb scrutiny without triggering the harsher legal restrictions. For families living under laws that could strip away land, education, and basic legal standing based on racial classification, identifying as Black Dutch or Black Irish was not vanity. It was often the difference between keeping a deed and losing one, between a child attending school and being turned away. Some families went further, claiming descent from Turks or from Romani groups, distant and foreign enough to explain unusual features, but framed as European, or at least not African or Native American in the eyes of the law. Whether any of these claims were literally true mattered less than what they accomplished. Each one offered just enough plausible deniability to let a family walk a careful line, different enough to explain their appearance, but not so different that they were forced into the categories the law reserved for its harshest treatment. Looking back, what these labels reveal most clearly is not anything about the Melungeons themselves, but about the system they were navigating. A legal and social framework so rigid in its racial categories that entire families spent generations constructing identities to survive inside it. For 2 centuries, the question of where the Melungeons came from was a matter of stories and suspicion. Then DNA testing arrived, and for the first time the question could be put to the genome itself rather than oral tradition. The results did not erase the old stories so much as reshuffle them. The single largest component of Melungeon ancestry, by a wide margin, turns out to be European. Most descendants carry the majority of their DNA from European sources, and the British Isles dominate, the same broad source population that supplied much of colonial Virginia and the Carolinas in the first place. That alone might seem to undercut the old folklore about Portuguese and Spanish sailors. But look closely at the European component, and a smaller signal appears alongside the British Isles' majority. Traces of Portuguese, Spanish, and broader Mediterranean ancestry, present in smaller amounts but consistently detectable. The oral tradition was not inventing something out of nothing. It was taking a real, if minor, genetic thread and building an origin story around it, one that conveniently happened to be more socially acceptable than the fuller picture. Surnames offer another thread worth pulling. Names like Collins, Gibson, and Mullins appear repeatedly across Melungeon families, and these are not obscure names. They are common English and Scottish surnames, the kind carried by ordinary settlers arriving in colonial Virginia in the 1600s and 1700s. Their persistence across generations of Melungeon families is itself a kind of genetic record, a paper trail running parallel to the DNA, both pointing back to the same colonial population. So the picture that emerges from the European side of the genome is not a dramatic origin story, but a layered one, a dominant base from the British Isles, consistent with ordinary colonial settlement, carrying the same surnames as their neighbors. And beneath that, a thinner but real layer of Iberian and Mediterranean ancestry, small enough to have been dismissed for 2 centuries, but large enough to leave a permanent trace, and large enough to have been the seed of a story that lasted 200 years. European ancestry is the largest piece of the Melungeon genome, but it is far from the whole picture, and the rest is where the story becomes most striking. A meaningful portion of Melungeon DNA traces back to Africa, and researchers have traced that thread to a specific period, the early 1600s, in colonial Virginia, when free or escaped African men formed unions with white women. At the time, this was not a marginal act. Virginia's legal system was actively constructing the racial categories that would define American life for centuries, and these unions sat outside the boundaries that system was trying to draw. Children born from these relationships occupied an undefined space from birth, neither fully inside nor outside the categories the law recognized. And many of these families would later become part of the population that migrated into Appalachia. That African ancestry did more than appear in the genome. It shaped how Melungeon families looked to their neighbors and how their neighbors treated them, feeding directly into the suspicion and legal restrictions described earlier. Alongside the African thread runs a Native American one, and it is as deeply woven into the story. Genetic markers connect Melungeon families to eastern woodlands tribes, including the Cherokee, the Powhatan, and the Catawba, peoples whose territories overlapped with the regions where these families lived and later settled. This was not a distant or symbolic connection. Early intermarriage with native communities happened on the ground, in the same colonial landscape where European and African ancestry was taking shape, and it left its own genetic signature, one that persists in Melungeon DNA today. Together, these 2 threads, African and Native American, did something important. They tied Melungeon families to the land itself, to places and communities, in a way that European ancestry alone never could. When these families moved into the mountains, They were not arriving as strangers to the region in every sense. Parts of their ancestry were already there, woven into the same hills and river valleys long before their wagons arrived. A quiet continuity running underneath 2 centuries of displacement and survival. Before I show you the last part, if you've ever looked at your own results and wondered where the Melungeon mystery fits into your own bloodline, I put it all together in a guide called Where Do You Really Come From? Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. Beyond the broad ancestry percentages, there is a finer layer of evidence written into specific genetic markers, the haplogroups passed down along single lines of descent, father to son and mother to daughter, unchanged for thousands of years. On the paternal side, the most common haplogroup among Melungeon men is R1b, the marker most strongly associated with Western Europe, especially Britain, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal. Its dominance lines up neatly with everything the broader genome already suggested, a population whose paternal lines trace overwhelmingly back to early European settlers. But R1b is not the only signal present. A meaningful number of Melungeon men carry haplogroup E1b1a, a lineage strongly associated with sub-Saharan Africa, a genetic echo of the African ancestry that entered the population in the early 1600s. And smaller still, haplogroup I appears in some lines, a marker more common in Scandinavian and Germanic populations, adding another thread to an already complicated tapestry. The maternal side tells a parallel story. Haplogroup H, the most common maternal lineage in Europe, and one closely tied to the Neolithic farming expansion, shows up frequently among Melungeon women, reinforcing the deep European roots already visible elsewhere in the genome. Alongside it sits haplogroup U, a lineage shared between European and Near Eastern populations, often traced back to ancient hunter-gatherer groups that predate farming entirely. And then there is the smallest signal of all. Scattered through some Melungeon lines are faint Middle Eastern genetic markers, the kind that researchers have linked to 2 different possible sources: Sephardic Jewish families fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, or Ottoman Turks brought to the Americas as captives by early European explorers. These traces are real, but they are small, far too small to support the old folk theories that painted the Melungeons as a hidden colony of Turks or Moors. What they do support is something quieter but more interesting. A population built not from one dramatic foreign origin, but from dozens of small contributions, each one a fragment of a much larger story of forced and voluntary migration across the Atlantic world, in the hollows of Hancock County. So go back to that image of Hancock County, families whose faces have puzzled their neighbors for 2 centuries. The mystery was never really about appearance. It was about ancestry that did not fit the single origin story most of Appalachia tells about itself. What the genome shows is a mosaic, a dominant European base from the British Isles, a minor thread of Iberian and Mediterranean ancestry, African lineages reaching back to the early 1600s, Native American ties to the Cherokee, the Powhatan, and the Catawba, and faint traces of Sephardic or Ottoman ancestry scattered through a few lines. No single origin story, Portuguese sailor, lost colonist, or hidden Turk, was the whole truth. Each was a fragment, exaggerated or distorted, of something more complicated and more American. A population built from collision, intermarriage, and survival, hidden in plain sight for generations because the law had no box for them. The Melungeons are still not an anomaly. They are a magnified version of a pattern playing out across the Atlantic world. So here is the question worth sitting with. How many other families, in how many other hollows, carry their own hidden mosaics, waiting for the right test to finally speak?